broadcast, unlike any other I know. It's like eavesdropping on a private celebration. And host Cerys Matthews has such a clear voice which can be heard on the shortwaves, even if reception isn't brilliant. Can I ask what year the first of these annual midwinter broadcasts was made?
Hello, over to you. This is Robert. Although the Antarctic Midwinter broadcast airs on digital channels, it's become a favourite for shortwave listeners. Could you tell us how the programme is broadcast around the world, and how do the overwinterers at Rotherham listen to it?
Well, joining me is the show's producer, Martin Redfern. Hello, Martin.
Hi, Rajan.
Now, this is unlike anything else on the World Service. And let's start with Alan's question. How did it all start?
Well, the first people to have overwintered on a permanent base in Antarctica was during World War II in 1944 in Port Lockroy, and their only way of communicating was by shortwave. As far as we can tell, though, the broadcast from the BBC World Service didn't start until 1955 as a service for the Falkland Islands dependency. So it's been going for a really long time, and it's really become deeply embedded in the midwinter celebration.
So to answer Rob, how the overwinterers in the Antarctic listen to the special broadcast.
Well, it's a bit like candles at Christmas. We've got electric lights now, but we still light candles. They've got internet, probably better internet than I've got in rural Wales at home here, but they still love to listen to it on shortwave.
Well, joining Martin and myself now is listener and Antarctic explorer, Dr. Sian Henley, who's in Edinburgh in Scotland. Hello, Sian.
Hello.
Now then, tell me then about your own fascinating connections with Antarctica.
I've been lucky enough to go to Antarctica 5 times and spend almost 2 years there in total. And for that, I've mostly been based at Rotherham, where we heard the messages for on the broadcast. And my work there is studying the changes occurring in the marine ecosystems in response to climate change.
And this broadcast, is it a big deal there? I mean, do people, treat it like Christmas Day?
It's huge. It's bigger than Christmas Day because Christmas Day comes at a very busy time of year in terms of tasks that need to be done on base. So it's really a time to kick back, relax, and just enjoy the incredible environment that you're in, and importantly, to hear from people in the real world through the messages that are sent and some of the additional communications offerings that are put on to connect people with their loved ones at home.
Sian Henley, thank you so much indeed.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me on. Bye-bye.
That's a blackbird in midsummer in Kew Gardens, sending you best wishes for you in the middle of your winter. The good weather is going to come again.
Why this year did you decide, or did the BBC decide, to make this into a global broadcast?
Well, I took over producing it in 2007 when I had just been selected for my own trip to Antarctica. I was so thrilled I wanted to give something back. In those days, it was thought of as a little bit of a favour that we did for the British Antarctic Survey and not of much interest to anybody else. But since then, it's grown and grown. And in 2015, we got Cerys Matthews as one of the guest celebrities, and she was so taken with it that she agreed to present it thereafter. And because it's become such an entertaining programme and such a human, quite moving sometimes programme, World Service agreed that it should reach a bigger audience. It's always had a very enthusiastic follower of shortwave listeners, picking it out from all the interference, but now it's gone global.
Martin Redfern, thank you so much indeed.
Thank you, Rajan.
Next, and the BBC World Service is always keen to get to know about listeners' everyday lives and habits. And to do this, we have our insightful and often revealing series, How I Hear.
This is Mette in Denmark. Over the years, my listening to the BBC World has been quite linked to my location, growing up in Denmark. But then I spent 7 years in Malawi, and that's when I really started to tune in. Now when I'm back in Denmark, I kind of maintain that habit, and also when I travel. I think what I appreciate the most is your news programs, really the global outlook that takes us to all corners of the world and also gives us an insight to that amazing resilience and creativity and strength that our fellow humans around the globe have. And especially I appreciate journalists like Zainab Badawi.
Tsitsi Dangaremba in Harare, welcome to Hard Talk. Your latest book...
With her intelligent and inquisitive questions, always manages to unfold complex issues and make people share whatever they have to share. What I don't like is that I sometimes feel too much time is spent on sports, commenting and broadcasting.
Euro 2020 from the BBC.
Hello, I'm Lee James, and this is Sports World's Euros special.
On the other hand, I can't help thinking about someone in Suriname and in DR Congo listening to the broadcast and feeling connected through the football game. And then I just realize I have to just switch to a different channel and appreciate that other people benefit from this kind of broadcast. I also feel that sometimes the coverage of the British royal family and other sort of more British topics are covered a little bit too much.
Hello, I'm Ross Atkins. Each week on the BBC World Service, I look in depth at one of the biggest stories in the news. In this edition, it's the Harry and Meghan interview and how the royal family...
And another important role I think BBC World fulfills is to give a voice to people who would normally not be heard by a wider audience.
Today we're going to Côte d'Ivoire. The country's commercial capital, which is called Abidjan, is known for its thriving LGBT scene. Unlike many of its West African neighbours...
And it's so encouraging sometimes to hear all the important struggles and issues people can explain and give an insight to for other people. And I think more than ever, we really need that now, something that connects us across the globe.
And if, like Mette in Denmark, you too would like to tell us how you hear the BBC World Service, then do get in touch.
The email is overtoyou@bbc.co.uk, or you can tweet at overtoyoubbc.
And with that, it's time to say goodbye. I'm Rajan Datta, the producer is Howard Shannon, and we'll be back with more of your feedback at the same time next week.
This is the BBC World Service, home of in-depth news and current affairs.
This is a moment in time for our common humanity.
Twice a day, every day. Interviews, news and analysis.
The situation here is getting worse and worse.
The day's events from around the world and sometimes above it.
A couple hundred miles below you, the Earth itself.
NewsHour, Saturday and Sunday at 12 and 20 GMT. And at bbcworldservice.com, Crowd Science with Anand Jagatia.
We're looking at all things smelly. How does our sense of smell actually work? We meet scientists whose job it is to collect and classify the smells around us, and we'll also be hearing about people who have lost their smell after COVID-19 and how they can get it back.
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
This is Sports Hour on the BBC World Service with me, Shabnam Yunus-Jewell. Coming up this week, we're at the European Football Championships as the knockout stages begin, while Sporting Witness takes a look back at the 1976 final. Plus, we'll mark your card ahead of Wimbledon, which starts on Monday. Can anyone beat Novak Djokovic?
But he does have Stefanos Tsitsipas in his half. Stefanos was up 2 sets against Novak in the French Open final. But Novak has shown winning 5 Wimbledons. I don't see anyone stopping him, to be honest.
And in the week that Pelé called for snooker to be included at the Olympics, we speak to the only professional Brazilian snooker player and the surprising sacrifices he's had to make.
This lockdown, I don't like too much. I stay in UK 4 months alone. No one visit or talk with me here. I want to see my family.
More from Igor Figueiredo when Sports Hour starts in 5 minutes.
BBC News. Hello, this is Jerry Smith. An extended coronavirus lockdown has taken effect in the Australian city of Sydney to contain a sharp rise in cases of the Delta variant. The restrictions will now cover all of Australia's biggest city and surrounding areas. It's also been doubled to 2 weeks. From Sydney, Phil Mercer sent this report.
The New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian said this was the scariest period the state has faced since the pandemic began. At the start of the school holidays, Australian police have warned that car licence plate recognition technology will ensure that residents don't stray from the lockdown zone. The outbreak is linked to a limousine driver working with international aircrew at Sydney Airport.
Thousands of people are trying to leave the Bangladeshi capital Dhaka as the country prepares for a strict nationwide lockdown starting on Monday. Pictures show crowds and vehicles packed onto ferries and processions of people on foot, bicycles and in rickshaws. The lockdown has been triggered by a recent increase in new coronavirus cases, many attributed to the Delta variant, which has spread rapidly in neighbouring India. Hospitals in areas of Bangladesh near the Indian border have become overwhelmed. Relatives of George Floyd, whose murder in the US last year sparked worldwide protests against racism, have called the jail term imposed on the former policeman who killed him a historic step towards racial reconciliation. Derek Chauvin was sentenced to 22.5 years in prison by a court in the state of Minnesota. Some of Mr. Floyd's family had been calling for a longer sentence. His brother Rodney spoke outside court.
Looking at his daughter, beautiful daughter Gianna, in her video, saying the first video, my dad changed the world. He did change the world. But at the end result, he gets a slap on the wrist.
Reports from Afghanistan suggest that the Taliban have claimed further gains overnight after heavy fighting in many parts of the country. Correspondents say government forces regained control of a district in the eastern province, Paktiar, but were driven out of districts in Helmand and Kandahar in the south and in Parwan. On Friday, President Biden assured the Afghan president of America's continuing support. Here's Lise Doucette.
The Taliban have taken at least 50 districts since May. They're moving ever closer to key provincial capitals, raising concern, of course, that they will push even towards Kabul. Now, President Ghani emphasized again that the Afghan security forces would be able to protect themselves, but everyone I speak to, and I was in Kabul just weeks ago, says this is going to be a very bloody summer.
Lise Doucette. World News from the BBC. Hungary's Justice Minister Judith Vorga has told the BBC that her country firmly rejects criticism from Western Europe of a new law banning the promotion of homosexuality to under 18s. She said it was designed to protect children and guarantee the rights of parents. Ms. Vorga described EU criticism as a shameless misinterpretation of the law and insisted that Hungary did not discriminate against anyone. The authorities in Myanmar have set fire to illegal narcotics worth hundreds of millions of dollars to mark the International Day Against Drug Abuse and Trafficking. In Yangon, drugs, including opium, heroin, ketamine and crystal meth, created a blaze so fierce that firefighters had to douse the flames. There were similar ceremonies in other cities. Australia's National Swimming Authority has acknowledged that athletes have experienced what it called unacceptable behaviour for decades. There have been fresh allegations of abuse in the sport. Our Asia-Pacific editor Michael Bristow has more details.
The admission comes after accusations made earlier this month by the Olympic medalist Madeline Groves. She withdrew from trials for the Tokyo Games, blaming misogynistic perverts who she said used psychological abuse to exploit girls and young women. Australian media have reported that 6 more swimmers have made complaints. The body that oversees the sport, Swimming Australia, has faced similar allegations in the past. In its latest statement, it acknowledged historical abuse, but it said it was committed to creating a safe environment for swimmers. It set up an all-female panel to hear accusations of mistreatment.
The 108th edition of the world's most prestigious cycle race, the Tour de France, begins shortly. Competitors will spend the first half parading around the western city of Brest before getting down to the race proper. The 21 stages will end in Paris on July the 18th. BBC News.
Hello, you're listening to but firmly focused on completing the Tour de France.
When you're in the mountains, it's quite spiritual. You know, they seem to have their own sense of atmosphere, and it's amazing when you're climbing up some iconic climbs, which we are doing this year as well. But getting into Paris is for me, fresh every time I take it on. It's just very emotional.
You can hear more from Jeff Thomas, who's raising money for leukemia research by riding the Tour de France course 1 week ahead of the rest. Plus Sporting Witness hears from Antonin Panenka, who in the European Championship final of 1976 created a style of winning penalties so famous they named it after him. The Panenka. We've all heard of it. We've all seen a few, some good, some bad. And with the Olympics less than a month away, could sporting organisations be doing more to mitigate the environmental impact of major events?
Actually, my answer to this, influencing the people who don't go to the games. The IOCs of the world, the FIFAs, Major League Baseball, EPL are doing really good jobs at greening the games. But if that's all they do, leveraging the impact of sports is just, you're missing it.
We'll hear more Lou Blaustein telling us what Eco-Athletes is all about later, but we start with the knockout stages of Euro 2020, which begin today. Maz Faruqi is our reporter in Budapest. Hi there, Maz.
Hello, Shabnam.
Do you think it's working, holding the competition across the continent like this, and might this happen again in the future?
I think it has worked in terms of obviously teams being able to move about. It's been very tough. It's been challenging in these travel bans, these travel bubbles that everybody has to be in. And you think, don't you, of some of the fans later today when Wales play Denmark in the last 16 tie, the first of those matches in Amsterdam. There won't be any Welsh fans there at all to be able to cheer on their team. And you know, I think the tournament does lack some of the atmosphere that those moments, those fans can help create. Some of the best moments, I think, of this tournament so far have been the two home matches, if you like, for Hungary here in Budapest, in that Puskás Arena, that match, that unlikely draw they managed to get against France. The crowd was so important in helping cheer on their team to that unlikely draw. And moments like that is what we've missed at these Euros, as good as some of the football has been that we've seen on the pitch. I think until we can get crowds like that back safely across the continent, then maybe perhaps this multi-format tournament across nations isn't going to be something we're going to be seeing for the time being, at least.
OK, you mentioned Wales-Denmark, one of the two Saturday games. Later, one of the favourites in action as well.
Yes, Italy, Shabnam, and they've been so impressive to watch. I was babbling on about how cool they all look in Friday Sport Today. They remind me of some of the great Italian teams I used to watch down the years, players like Alessandro Del Piero, Paolo Maldini, Francesco Totti. The difference, I think, with this side is that they don't seem to have two or three really big names that the other players are expected to play around and support. It's very much a team effort, and they seem to just really enjoy playing football together, which is why I think I've enjoyed so much watching them. They are very heavy favourites, as you say, against Austria on Saturday in London. That's the other last 16 match on Saturday today. Austria have never made it this far at the men's Euros, and what you don't want to be doing in that situation is playing an opponent who are on a run of 30 games without defeat, as Italy are. The biggest stumbling block, I think, for Italy this side is maybe just themselves. If they start to read some of the hype, believe some of the hype, and that sense of excitement that is starting to build around them this tournament. And yes, I really think that Italy are a team that we're going to be talking about an awful lot over the next week or so. It would be a big shock if they weren't into the quarterfinals, I think.
Indeed, and I used to be a big fan of football, Italia back in the 90s as well. Now, Sunday, we've got Budapest hosting Netherlands against the Czech Republic. Will that be the last game in Budapest then?
I think it will be now. There were reports circulating last week that because of the relaxed restrictions around coronavirus here, things are pretty much back to normal, bar the wearing of face coverings on public transport. You can eat in restaurants because they point to their really successful vaccination programme that they've rolled out. Obviously, as part of that is the reason why they've been able to host nearly capacity crowds at the Puskás Arena here. Biggest crowds that I've seen covering football games the last year or so, 66,000 or so. And because of that, there was these reports that they might be considered to host the semi-finals and the finals if those matches have been taken away from Wembley Stadium and London. But those kinks between the UK government and UEFA about organisations around those games, those seem to have been ironed out now, and they will host them, we believe. So we do expect this last 16 tie on Sunday to be the last one we'll see.
Quickly look ahead to the other games as well. What else is catching your eye, Maz?
Yeah, two matchups in particular, Shabnam. Portugal, the holders, just scraped through to the last 16 on Wednesday. It was the Cristiano Ronaldo show once more at the Puskás Arena against France. His two penalties dragged them over the line in their group. He is in great form, and I'm really interested to know how he'll fare against the number one ranked side in the world in Belgium. We're going to have some huge names on the field for that game. Ronaldo, Kevin De Bruyne, Romelu Lukaku, Diogo Jota, Bernardo Silva. So that Portugal-Belgian game, well, it just promises so much. The other big one is Tuesday's match at Wembley, 25 years on since the two met in the knockout stages at Euro 96, England against Germany. It's such a tough one to call. What we do know is that matches between these sides tend to go all the way to the nervy and dreaded penalty shootout. And it was England's manager now, Gareth Southgate, remember, who missed the crucial spot kick in the semi-finals in 1996 against Germany at Wembley. Germany then went on to win that European Championship. So I wonder if that is an omen. I don't know, but it's always one of those matches that whatever happens, that we as football fans always look forward to, because there's such a great rivalry between those two sides.
Absolutely, and I think that dog behind you is pretty excited for these knockout stages as well. So yes, thank you so much for talking to us, and enjoy the weekend.
Thank you.
Our reporter Maz Faruqi there in Budapest. Should be a great weekend at the Euros. Now we're going to go from football to snooker, and we're going to do it seamlessly, I promise you, because believe it or not, the football legend Pele has been on social media this week actually calling for snooker to become an Olympic event. And as it turns out, it's not just the Brazilian icon who's a big fan of the Green Bays, it's a country obsessed. So who better to give us the lowdown on samba snooker than the only Brazilian professional player, the world number 75, Igor Figueiredo.
Brazil, very, very popular. Have thousands and thousands of clubs. Because TV, every weekend have snooker in TV. But now little down, but now come back very popular. I think have millions and millions tables, really. But not only full size, very small tables like English pool. Every corner have one table like this. This week I sent a message yesterday because people in Brazil, I put my draw for next tournament, where I watch, because very, very popular. This last season, last year, I think my name improved a lot, have a lot noise. Hobby Walker also helped me about my nicknames. I think in future maybe change again, but Senna Snooker or Pele Potter, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, when you hear somebody like Pele talking about snooker, obviously people are going to listen. And what do you think about what Pele has been saying then about snooker should be an Olympic sport then?
I think, wow.
Would you like to maybe meet Pele one day and talk snooker, maybe play some snooker with Pele?
Of course. I want a lot to talk, not only Pele because of the big hero, but Neymar, because Neymar also like to play snooker. Yeah. Maybe sister the Ayrton Senna, because I'm very, very fan of Ayrton Senna. After Ayrton Senna dead, I never see Formula One again. This is how I love Ayrton Senna, you know me. But really, I want to see Pelé. Yeah, very, very good, very good.
You yourself have, you've come over here to the UK, you've made that sacrifice, and you've been away from your family for quite a long time, haven't you, on tour, especially this last year?
Really, so this lockdown, I don't like too much remember. I remember when it started lockdown, airline from Portugal cancel my ticket. I'm still fighting to get my money back, never give me back. I stay in UK 4 months alone. No one visit or talk with me here. I want to see my family because I'm scared. I don't know about this. The first sound about the COVID, you never know you'll survive or you'll die. And really, I just go to Christmas. And this season also, because rules every 2 months change the rules a lot. I'm still here. Last time I see my family for Christmas as well. Maybe I see again only December. It's very sacrificed because I have my dad old. I have 2 children, especially 2 very young, and my wife. Yeah, a lot sacrifice for my dreams, but only my dreams. Really, I fighting to improve snooker in Brazil, in the Americas, because I want to push my name up and try my best. Maybe I get very good result to try to change, to give more opportunity for new generation.
Well, that's very, very noble of you. When will you next see your family then?
Next, only December.
Wow. Only for Christmas. Oh, wow. So that must be very difficult to stay away from them.
I see my family maybe one time a year. It's very difficult, very difficult. I practice every day, gym, similar deja vu every day, yeah.
The only professional snooker player there from South America, but Brazilian Igor Figueiredo, talking to me about Pelé, being an ambassador for the sport and being away from his family for quite a long time during the pandemic. We do hope he's reunited with them very soon, and we wish him the best of luck for the new season, which starts next month. Now, just keeping the theme green here on Sports Hour, it's just a matter of days until Tokyo 2020 gets underway, and organisers are aiming for them to be the greenest ever games. But should sport be doing more to raise awareness of the environment? Well, we've come across Eco Athletes, which is a new organisation that brings together sports stars and environmental educators to help spread the word. It has 7 athletes going to the Games, and Lou Blaustein is the president of Eco Athletes.
Our mission is to inspire and coach athletes to lead climate action. But put more colloquially, what we want to do is find and deploy the Muhammad Ali's, the Marcus Rashfords, the Megan Rapinos of the climate fight. Athletes have been active on a myriad of social issues going back decades. And actually, we are now in a new era of athlete activism. But on climate change, not so much. And the tragic part is we don't have time for athletes not to get involved. My apologies for the double negative. And this whole thing was crystallized for me in 2018 when, and this is in baseball, Mike Trout, who is the best player in baseball, got in 2018 a 12-year, $400 million plus US dollar contract extension. And everybody in the sports world went, wow, look at all that money. And I thought, wow, 12 years. The UN IPCC just came out with a report, and that's like this consortium of climate scientists who every year or so issue a state of the climate report. And they said humanity has 12 years to decarbonize by 45% for us to avoid the worst consequences of climate change. So basically the length of Mike Trout's contract extension, which when you put, in baseball terms, that's an eon. In climate time, that's nothing. And so I say, we have a Mike Trout problem. Mike Trout will be fine. He's going to be okay. But the clock is ticking.
But what are the athletes that are involved with you actually, what can they do practically? What are they doing?
As of today, we have 40 Eco Athletes champions, and they are from all over the world, women, men, a variety of sports. As of today, 7 will be appearing in the Olympics in Tokyo. And so what we ask them to do is to speak out on climate and to share, and also to share on social, which is such a powerful medium. and to use our hashtag, which is hashtag climate comeback, because we believe the climate needs a comeback, and who fashions comebacks but athletes and sports teams?
What do you think then? What more can the Olympics or sport in general do then to impact the climate?
Well, this is a great question. And when people ask the question, and I'm not saying you're thinking of it in this way, but in general, what they think of is what can they do at the facilities to make the games, reduce their carbon impact or avoid carbon or then offset it. And, that's great. But when you think about it, the power of sports it goes far beyond the venues. In fact, Adam Silver, who's the commissioner of the NBA, said that only 1% of NBA fans go to NBA games. So actually, my answer to this is that it's influencing the people who don't go to the games. The IOCs of the world, the FIFAs, Major League Baseball, EPL are doing really good jobs at greening the games. But if that's all they do, the impact of sports, leveraging the impact of sports is just, you're missing it. You've got to tell the story on television or however people are consuming games now on their computers, etc. And then ask, or either directly or, through persuasion, fans to take climate actions themselves and or demand it of businesses, of governments, and other institutions. That's the power of sports. And the Olympics, in 2016 at the opening ceremonies in Rio, there was a climate vignette as part of a climate-themed vignette as part of the opening ceremonies. When you think about it, 1 billion people are watching the opening ceremonies. So no one really knows this, but that still stands as the biggest audience for any climate messaging ever, was at the 2016 Olympic opening ceremonies.
Well, there you go. There's a little bit about eco-athletes from its president, Luke Blaustein, talking to us from New York City. Okay, we're going to stay in America because one of golf's biggest prizes, the Women's PGA Championships, is taking place this weekend in Atlanta, Georgia. The American Nelly Korda is the halfway leader by one shot. I think she fired a quite brilliant 63 in her second round. Golf is continuing to choose Georgia for its big events. The Men's Masters is held every April at the famous Augusta course, and the season-ending Tour Championship will be played there in September. It's a very different stance to that taken by Major League Baseball. In April, the MLB moved its All-Star game from the state after new voting regulations were voted in. The Republicans maintain they will make elections safer and less open to fraud, but the Democrats believe they will impact turnout, particularly in underrepresented communities. So why did baseball take a stand but not golf? Professor Tim Kellison from Georgia State University explained more.
Well, I think it would take probably one of three things for the PGA of America to relocate their events. Some decision-making on the part of the sponsors, PGA of America or the LPGA, or in this case, KPMG, which is the title sponsor of the Women's PGA Championship. It would take one or all of those entities to really speak out and say, this is the Georgia voting laws don't align with our values. In the absence of that, it would require probably athletes to speak out. Right now in the United States and, pretty much worldwide, athletes are getting an increasing amount of attention and people are recognizing the platforms that they have. So the case of Major League Baseball, many players, even some managers of different clubs started speaking out against the Georgia voting laws. And there hasn't been so much of that on the golf side or really in other sports as well. And in the absence of that, it would require probably fans or potential attendees to say, well, we're just not going to show up to these events. And that's probably the least likely of any of the three. So I think that's why you're not seeing such attention on professional golf for both the women's and men's sides, because there's been not such a concerted effort on the side of the sponsors or of athletes to say, well, we oppose this, or we don't really feel comfortable playing in the state right now.
Okay. Now, this, of course, is this huge conversation when it comes to sport and politics and this sort of clash of it. What role do you think sport can play in driving these conversations and political change?
Yeah, well, this is not unprecedented. There have been other sports-led boycotts or relocations in the past. In the early 90s, the National Football League moved the Super Bowl out of the state of Arizona because of the state's refusal to recognize a paid holiday honoring Martin Luther King Jr. And more recently, in 2017, the NCAA and the Atlantic Coast Conference, they said that they would no longer hold championship events in the state of North Carolina following legislation that was going to require transgender people from using the restrooms that corresponded to their sex assigned at birth. And that same year, the NBA moved its All-Star game from Charlotte, North Carolina, because of the same so-called bathroom bill. That legislation did not pass, or it never went up for a vote, I believe. And many pointed to the NCAA and the NBA's vocal opposition to that bill as a reason that really never got it off the ground.
But in this case, you don't think it's enough to change the legislation that we're talking about?
Probably not yet. So this move is largely symbolic. Certainly, it has been politicized. The move has been politicized to serve both sides of this argument. And if nothing else, it is capturing the attention of the public in general to look more closely at what these laws are doing and what they are restricting in this case. The reality is, though, that this move of the All-Star game from Atlanta is difficult in some sense because these laws are occurring all throughout the United States. So in many ways, it's becoming more difficult where to select these events if the idea is that we're not going to be playing our events or having our events take place in states that are restricting voting or making it more difficult for folks to get out and vote.
Professor Tim Callison there from Georgia State University on the relationship between sport and politics in America. Now, you're listening to Sports Hour with me, Shabnam Yunus-Jewell. Thank you for joining us today. On the weekend, the Euro 2020 knockout stages get underway with Wales against Denmark. You can hear commentary from Amsterdam in Sports World with Delith Lloyd starting today at the later time of 14 GMT. And we've got plenty more to come in the second half of the show as well. We're going to look ahead to Wimbledon and hear from a former footballer in the middle of cycling the whole Tour de France. Stay with us. We will be back in a couple of minutes.
This is the BBC World Service, where we're always asking the big questions.
Exercise more, eat less, you'll probably end up losing some weight. And to check, a quick step on the scales. But how would you weigh something bigger? Much, much bigger.
Well, I've put the scales on the ground. What I really need to do is put them the other way up.
On the next episode of Crowd Science, we find out if the Earth is getting heavier or lighter.
I think what a lot of people don't recognize is how big our atmosphere actually is.
Every single year, the Earth captures about 10,000 tons of dust.
Join me, Marnie Chesterton, as we try and weigh the world.
Does my equator look big in this? Crowd Science at bbcworldservice.com/crowdscience.
You're listening to Sports Hour on the BBC World Service with me, Shabnam Yunus-Jewell. Still to come, the England football international and leukemia survivor Jeff Thomas on his charity bike ride around the full route of this year's Tour de France. How tennis is trying to shed its elitist image. And in Sporting Witness, we go back to Euro 76 when Czechoslovakia were the surprise winners of the first international tournament to be decided by a penalty shootout. We're back in 2 minutes.
BBC News with Jerry Smith. A 2-week coronavirus lockdown has come into force across the Australian city of Sydney and surrounding areas following a rise in cases of the more infectious Delta variant. The Premier of New South Wales described it as the scariest time of the pandemic for the state. Australia has vaccinated a relatively small percentage of its population. Large numbers of people are trying to leave the Bangladeshi capital Dhaka ahead of a nationwide lockdown starting on Monday. Crowds packed onto ferries and long lines of people streamed over bridges. Reports from Afghanistan suggest the Taliban have claimed further gains after heavy fighting in many parts of the country. Correspondents say government forces regained control of a district in the province of Paktiar, but were driven out of areas in Helmand, Kandahar and Parwan. Relatives of George Floyd, whose murder last year in the United States sparked worldwide protests against police brutality and racism, have welcomed the jail term imposed on his killer. Derek Chauvin was sentenced to 22.5 years in prison. Mr. Floyd's family described it as a historic step towards racial reconciliation. Hungary's Justice Minister Judith Varga has told the BBC that her country firmly rejects criticism from Western Europe of a new law banning the promotion of homosexuality to children. She said it was designed to protect children and guarantee the rights of parents. Australia's National Swimming Authority has acknowledged that athletes have experienced what it called unacceptable behaviour for decades. The admission follows allegations of abuse made earlier this month by Olympic medalist Madeleine Groves. And the world's most prestigious cycle race, the Tour de France, will begin in the next hour in the city of Brest. Spectators must observe social distancing. BBC News.
Thank you very much, Jerry, with the news there. You're listening to Sports Hour on the BBC World Service with me, Shabnam Yunus-Jewell. Still to come, Sporting Witness goes back to the European Football Championships of 1976. Czechoslovakia were the surprise winners of the first international tournament to be decided by a penalty shootout.
The goalie usually waits until the very last moment and then takes a risk as to whether to jump left or right. And I thought, what if I send the ball almost directly into the centre of the goal? So I started trying it in the contest with Hrushka, and I started winning.
But first, one of the most iconic sporting events on the annual calendar gets underway today, as you heard in the news earlier. The Tour de France is one of the toughest endurance events anywhere in the world. The 2-week race will see sprints, mountain climbs, and finally a procession on the Champs-Élysées into Paris. Well, one former England footballer is attempting to complete the exact same course a week ahead of the professionals, and all to raise money for research into leukemia. Jeff Thomas has already raised millions of dollars, having finished 4 previous tours, which at the age of 56 is no mean feat, probably at any age. Well, he set off a week ago today, and I spoke to him at the end of another gruelling day.
Well, I think we're waking everybody up at the hotel because we're starting about 5:30. So we're having breakfast from 5:30. We try and get away from the hotel about 6:30. And then we start the stage at 7. And then it is, the first day was about 130 odd miles, I think. And then the second day, again, it was 128 maybe. And bizarrely, the 100-mile bike ride seemed to be a norm. You know, at first, when you're training, you just think, I can't cover that amount of mileage. But when you're in the challenge itself, it becomes like a routine, but it's a tough routine for sure.
And while you're on the cycle, obviously, by yourself, solo, you are with a team. What would you say collectively are the challenges that you tackle on the way?
Well, yesterday we had strong headwinds, we had rain, and it's just everything that's a beautiful place like France is. You know, Brittany, where we started off, is renowned for its strong winds, and that's why they seem to start it quite often around that area. You know, you start the bike ride, you're on it for about 6 hours, and then you have a transfer and you're in a coach, and then you've really got to eat as quickly as possible. So we're up most of the day doing that, you know, and then time to sleep, we're probably doing 5 hours.
Absolutely. I mean, you talk about training. This must take some serious training. And I do wonder, I mean, you were a footballer, so you were obviously used to training and being fit, but you must be at your fittest right now.
Hopefully, I get fitter as the event goes on as well. I think from past experience, you do get stronger as it goes on, but then there's a danger of sort of fatiguing too much, and then it becomes really hard to get a recovery in. So it is a case of trying to keep that balance. And yeah, you know, without doubt, by the time you get to Paris and you survive this thing, you are a lot fitter, I can say, than I was playing football. And a lot lighter, I must say, as well.
Yeah, I mean, you look it. I mean, you mentioned recovery. So just talk us through, what do you do to recover each day? How much do you eat? Because you hear about you having to take on a certain amount of calories to keep going, etc. Yeah. What do you eat and how do you do it?
It's the usual gels and powders in the drink to give you nutrition as you're riding along. And on average, you're burning between 6,000 calories a day. And you can't get that back in with food, just meals. So it's difficult.
So you're definitely not eating 5 croissants as I do when I'm in France. It's definitely a lot more serious than that. But you're doing this for the 5th time, Jeff. Just explain to us why and why is it so special to you to do this route?
Well, I did it from my first challenge to really say thank you to the doctors and nurses who got me back to full fitness, because my first time I met Charlie Craddock, he more or less said I only had 3 months to live. And it was the skills of his team that got me back to full fitness after a 2-year battle in a stem cell transplant. And what can you do? You know, there's nothing that grabs the attention as much as doing something as iconic as the Tour de France. And I think back in 2005, there wasn't many people taking on, you know, probably a handful of people, as amateurs especially. And from then, it's been a great way of bringing people together from all walks of life. And even in the training and the event itself, you get them attached to the charity and the cause and why they're raising money and why they're sort of shouting about the cause as well. It's like any business, really. You're building a business and you want it to grow. And that's what we've been doing since 2005, trying to get people aware that their money is making a big difference.
You've certainly picked one of the most grueling sporting challenges that anybody could ever do. How do you actually feel when you're doing it and when you've completed it?
Taking the challenge on in the first place is the one that I always say to people. If you accept the challenge, then everything else falls into place. And by the time you get to Paris, you feel like you've achieved something really special.
Yeah, I bet you do. I mean, you've probably experienced it more times than some elite cyclists. I mean, can you explain just how it feels when you cross that finishing line?
I was just talking to some of the guys. When you're in the mountains, it's quite spiritual. You know, they seem to have their own sense of atmosphere, and it's amazing when you're climbing up some iconic climbs, which we are doing this year as well. But getting into Paris is for me, like you say, I've done it a number of times, but it's fresh every time I take it on. It's just very emotional, and I don't want to look too far ahead of it. I just like the football, you just take one game at a time, so it's one day at a time at the moment.
I've got to finish by asking you must have been keeping an eye on the football, on the Euros. What have you made of it so far then? Who have you been enjoying watching?
I thought England started off really well. You know, the first game, I thought it was bright. Second game, disappointing as an Englishman, as a spectacle. But England have done well enough. But you look at Germany and, you know, they look like they've got a little bit of flair about them at the moment. But we've got the players in England that a bit more confidence and a bit more, you know, positivity. Then I think we'll still do well.
Well, I do love your optimism, Jeff. Thank you. And I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you very much.
Jeff Thomas there, who will know exactly what the competitors will be feeling today at the Tour de France. Good luck to them all, including Nick Dalmini, who becomes the first black South African to appear at the Tour de France. Now, from one iconic summer sporting event to another, Wimbledon starts on Monday when the grass courts of SW19 are revealed for the first time in nearly 2 years. For many, it's the highlight of their sporting year, but for others, the sport of tennis is seen as elitist. And now the governing body for the sport in the UK, the Lawn Tennis Association, has come up with a new strategy aiming to increase diversity among players, coaches and fans. The LTA says it wants the people who play, work, volunteer in and watch tennis to reflect the diversity of the nation's communities, like 28-year-old tennis coach Miles Daly.
When I step on court, I like to wear my Jordans and I have my Beats headphones, and I'll probably wear like some kind of like basketball jersey or just something else, something slightly different, because I think it's important for people to see that not everyone looks the same, dresses the same, acts the same when they're on court. Essentially, tennis is an elitist sport. The majority of people who are playing it are white. The majority of them are white men. So even for women, there is that discrimination as well. So we all have kind of faced it in some way, shape, or form. Tennis needs to be more diverse. Tennis needs voices that are not saying that everything is okay because everything isn't okay. I was lucky enough to kind of be introduced to tennis at the time that Venus and Serena were becoming prominent. But if you compare that to football, nowhere near as many people that you would have been able to reference as people that would have been inspirational. But I know for me, definitely, if it wasn't for the Williams sisters, I may never have been that interested in tennis. We need to widen the pool from which we can pick from. We need to see more, for lack of a better word, colour in the sport, because it is a very all whites, lawn tennis, Wimbledon, classic game. And I think it should be more varied. And I feel like if we have more players that we can pick from that are from different backgrounds, the UK and GB will produce a higher calibre of tennis player, and we'll have more than just, Andy Murray, Jamie Murray, Joe Konta, Henry Watson to pick from. So, yeah, I try to talk about the idea group as much as I can, because I feel like it's important to have healthy discussions, even if they're uncomfortable discussions. I know that the little kids of colour, when I coach them, is something that they see that resembles themselves. What I want for my tennis landscape is to have a sport that reflects the world that I see. And I think we shouldn't underestimate that kids from 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, whatever age they're starting at, they want to see things that they can resonate with and that show them that what they're trying to do is possible. The UK, the LTA, we have such a diverse range of tennis players who we don't see. I feel like Heather Watson being a really good prime example of it. Like, she's a player of colour. She's won the Grand Slam. She's been in the top 50 of the game for a very long time now. And I don't know how many people could tell you those facts about her. So in that respect, I feel like we can do more to push forward the faces that look like the people that are in our society. But we're getting.
The coach, Miles Daly, there on the changing face of tennis. So what about this year's competition then? Will Serena Williams conquer again? Or will the winner be someone we'll meet for the first time properly this next 2 weeks? Well, I've been looking ahead to the tournament with the Egyptian tennis journalist Reem Aboulel. And we started by discussing Tunisia's Ons Jabeur, who's become the first Arab woman to win a WTA title with her recent victory at Birmingham.
Yes, I mean, she's already been doing amazingly in the last couple of years. And even like before the 5-month hiatus for the pandemic, and she was doing really, really well. And she made the quarterfinals in Australia, which was huge. But even after the tour picked up, after the hiatus, she was also doing amazing. And actually, Ons is the match wins leader for 2021. No one has won more matches than her on the women's tour this year, which is massive. The significance is, honestly, because it's been a build-up for her. She won a junior Grand Slam at Roland Garros when she was only 16 years old, but it took her 10 years to win her first WTA title. And during this journey, the Arab world saw how much she struggled. There was so much expectation on her from a very young age because it was massive. No female had ever won a junior Grand Slam from the Arab world. So there was so much expectation on her, but she didn't have the blueprint or anyone to follow or know how to make it from this region. She had to figure it out on her own, and it took her a very long time. Finally, when she managed to build a proper team around her, that's when things started to click. So people have been following for a long time, but some people had basically lost faith that she was going to make it. And the fact that after all this time, she's actually performing at the highest level, it's the impact is unbelievable because people are thinking, oh wow, like even we can do this. And she's training in Tunisia. She has an all Tunisian team, which makes it all like she's very proud that she always says, I'm a 100% Tunisian product. That's kind of her motto or her slogan. And everyone is following now. And you can see there are a couple of Egyptians who were playing qualifying at Wimbledon. They were speaking about how much of an impact she's making. It's huge, to be honest.
Just looking ahead to Wimbledon again and the women's draw, we've had the disappointing news that defending champion Simona Halep will not be playing. There's no Naomi Osaka as well. Do you think this makes it more likely for Serena Williams to break that record finally that she's been chasing for quite some time now?
In general, I feel that the women's draw these days, every match is tough. I know it's very cliche to say it, but honestly, the depth is unbelievable. So yes, when you have the defending champion out, when you have Naomi Osaka out, Naomi Osaka in general doesn't perform that well on grass. She hasn't mastered that surface yet. But Serena has landed in a tough quarter. First of all, she might get Angelique Kerber in the third round. So that would be a rematch of their final, actually, from a few years ago. She also has Coco Gauff in her section. She also has Elina Svitolina, the number 3 seed, who's a former semifinalist at Wimbledon. So I don't think it's still going to be that easy for Serena. It's never going to be easy for Serena, but we'll see.
It's generally quite unpredictable, isn't it, the women's draw? I mean, is that a good thing?
I personally think it's amazing. I cover both tours, but especially at the majors in the last few years, I find myself particularly drawn to the women's tournament just because the level is incredible. It's not unpredictable because, for example, someone was a fluke, a seed was a fluke, and turns out that they're not that good, or it's something like that. Genuinely, everyone who has a breakthrough ends up backing it up. Someone like Coco Gauff, for example, 2 years ago, on her Grand Slam debut, she made the 4th round at Wimbledon. But look at what she's done since, right? Making quarterfinals at the French Open, winning titles and everything, and she's only 17 years old. And she's just one example. I think it's amazing. I think people are bored of seeing the same people win over and over again. I remember when Serena was dominating and everyone was like, oh my God, Serena's always winning. So honestly, you can never please everybody because sometimes people are against dominance and some people are craving dominance. So I personally think the women's tour is as strong as it's ever been. And every slam, you really don't know what's going to happen. I think that's great.
Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it? Unlike probably the men's draw, especially at Wimbledon, now that we have no Rafa there, we have no Dominic Thiem, he's pulled out as well. It looks like it's going to be Novak Djokovic's to lose. I mean, even Rafa couldn't stop him winning in Paris. So who's going to stop him at Wimbledon?
Look, the draw has been kind to him, I have to say. Not that he needs a kind draw, but he's like, his half is quite manageable, I have to say, because the other side of the draw has Matteo Berrettini, who's the Italian who's in form, seeded number 7, just won a title on grass. He's really, really good. So he's not in the same half as Novak, nor is Federer, nor is Zverev or Medvedev. So there's just so many names who are in the bottom half. It really does look like it's Novak's to lose, but he does have Stefanos Tsitsipas in his half. Stefanos was up 2 sets against Novak in the French Open final. But Novak has shown, winning 5 Wimbledons, that he's just really, really, really solid at Wimbledon. And yeah, I don't see anyone stopping him, to be honest.
And we'll be right across Wimbledon 2021 here on the BBC World Service. Our coverage will begin in Sports World with Lee James on Sunday from 15 GMT. So you'll get all your Wimbledon build-up plus commentary on the Euro 2020 match between the Netherlands and Czech Republic too. Time now for Sporting Witness, and today we're going back to the European Football Championships of 1976. Czechoslovakia were the surprise winners of the first international tournament to be decided by a penalty shootout. And the man who scored that decisive spot kick was Antonin Panenka, and he created a daring new way to take a penalty. Sports Hour's Ian Williams reports.
It's Sunday, the 20th of June, 1976, and inside Belgrade's Red Star Stadium, midfielder Antonin Panenka is making the lonely walk from the halfway line to take a penalty that could make Czechoslovakia champions of Europe.
I was completely calm. I was looking forward to it. I could hear people crying out for me to end it.
Standing between Panenka and glory is West German goalkeeper Sepp Maier. The Germans are reigning world and European champions. But Panenka has a plan he has practiced many times before. He runs up to the ball quickly, but at the last split second, as Maier dives to his left, he chips it slowly down the middle.
I was just so filled with euphoria at having the chance to do something that no one ever had. I didn't know then that it would enter the football history books.
Over the years, the world's greatest players will copy this impudent style of penalty. It will become known simply as the Panenka. Antonin Panenka was born in December 1948 in Prague, the capital city of what was then post-war Czechoslovakia.
In summer, you played football, and in winter, you played ice hockey. There were those tiny pitches everywhere, interior courtyards between apartment blocks and so on. I played at least 5 or 6 hours of football a day.
Panenka's father, Bohumil, also loved football and motorbikes.
We spent the whole time zipping around Prague, going to my training sessions and to the matches.
Panenka was only 9 when Bohumil got him a trial with Bohemians, one of the Prague-based clubs, where he would become a midfield regular in the years following the 1968 Soviet invasion. An occupation that brutally put down the so-called Prague Spring, a bid for liberal reform in the country.
Gunfire has been heard in the streets of Prague as Soviet troops tighten their grip on the city.
In the communist system, you also had to have a job. And so the young Panenka would get up at 4:30 every morning to operate a lathe in a metal factory before training. Panenka's debut for Czechoslovakia came in September 1973, a World Cup qualifier in Scotland.
It was at Hampden Park, 100,000 people in the stands. At Bohemians, we got a maximum 11, maybe 14,000. I'd never seen so many fans in a stadium.
Panenka scored 3 goals as the Czechs topped Group 1 in qualification for the 1976 Euros. He scored again in their final qualifier against the Soviet Union to help book a place in the European Championship finals.
They were our main enemy. For the fans, it was always a bit more personal.
The 1976 Euros were held in Yugoslavia, and only 4 teams took part. Czechoslovakia would end up facing 2 of the greatest teams of all time, including a Dutch side captained by Johan Cruyff.
We definitely went there as outsiders. I personally was worried we would just fall apart. The Dutch were probably the best team in the world at that point.
But the Dutch were dispatched on a rain-soaked night in Zagreb, 3-1 following extra time. There was also extra time in Belgrade, where West Germany beat Yugoslavia.
We were just euphoric. We knew that whatever happened in the final, even if we'd lose, we were just huge heroes in the eyes of the people.
4 days later, the Czechs made another fast start. Jan Švelik's far post finish put them 1-0 ahead after just 8 minutes of the final. 17 minutes later, Karol Dabias rifled home to make it 2.
I couldn't stop thinking that the Germans always played until the final minute. They proved this in their match against Yugoslavia, when they'd also gone 2-0 down, and in the end they won 4-2.
Panenka's concern was justified. 3 minutes after Dabias' goal, Dieter Müller pulled one back, and with 89 minutes on the clock, Bernd Holzenbein's header from a corner drew West Germany level, 2-2.
We thought we had it in the bag. Then again, thank God the Germans did equalise. I wouldn't have become famous if they hadn't.
With no goals in extra time, the final went to penalties. Although shootouts had been used for many years as a way to settle draws, Euro 76 was the first major international tournament to employ them, and the Czechs were prepared.
The trainers had a vision of it ending like this, so we trained for penalties, to make it more realistic, to motivate us. Over the loudspeakers, they played the sound of fans cheering and screaming in the match against Scotland.
The first 7 penalties were all successful. Then a miss. German forward Uli Hoeneß blazing over the bar. Next up, Panenka.
I suddenly had the advantage of being able to decide who would claim the title. And I also had this alternative plan to take a penalty in a way that nobody had ever seen before.
But where had the idea for this audacious penalty come from? For that, we have to go back in time to the Bohemians' training ground, where Panenka took part in informal penalty competitions against goalkeeper Zdeněk Hruška, betting for things like beer and chocolate.
I was constantly paying him, and so in the evenings, before I fell asleep, I used to think up ways to beat him. And that was when I realized that a goalie usually waits until the very last moment and then takes a risk as to whether to jump left or right. And I thought, what if I send the ball almost directly into the center of the goal? So I started trying it in the contest with Hruška, and I started winning.
Fast forward 2 years, and Panenka is planning to use this trick in front of 30,000 fans on the biggest stage of his career.
I was so filled with euphoria, so brimming with optimism. I was convinced, not 100, but 1,000% that it would be a goal. It must have been a higher power or something.
Panenka was confident. His roommate, Czech goalkeeper Ivo Victor, was not.
Ivo knew I was going to take it like this, and he told me, it's so risky taking a penalty like this, in a situation like this. If you don't score, I'm not going to let you back in the room.
But Panenka was right. As the German keeper dived out of the way, his delicate chip sailed serenely into the goal, sparking celebrations that saw him buried under a pile of red-shirted bodies.
We'd become European champions, but none of us could believe it. It was like Alice in Wonderland.
Panenka's daring wowed football fans around the world, but also meant he'd only be remembered for that iconic spot kick.
All the moments I created in football, all the passes, all the goals, all the assists, they're all drowned out by that one penalty. So that does sadden me a little bit. But on the other hand, of course, it's a great honour.
Decades on, penalty takers brave enough still copy that moment from 1976.
When I invented that penalty kick, when I became its spiritual father, as it were, it never occurred to me that I would enter the footballing history books. It's a beautiful feeling when someone takes a shot like that and is described as a Panenka kick. I'm extremely proud.
Great memories of 1976 there. Thank you to Sporting Witness with Ian Williams. Now, that's all we've got time for on Sports Hour this week with me, Shabnam Yunus-Jewell. Thank you for keeping me company. Caroline Barker will be back next week, so we'll see you then.
You're listening to the BBC World Service, where Aisling Kaur continues her investigation into one of the world's biggest yoga schools.
In 2019, Julie Salter accused the late founder of Shivananda Yoga of multiple counts of abuse. Join me as I discover a dark legacy surrounding Shivananda Yoga.
Guru, a dark legacy at bbcworldservice.com/documentaries. And in 60 minutes.
A Right to Health. I'm Razia Iqbal, and I'll be joined by Dr. Paul Farmer, the renowned physician, anthropologist and writer, to answer questions from people around the world about healthcare where they live or work.
That's in an hour. The newsroom is next on the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
At 10 hours GMT, with the Delta variant on its shores and vaccination rates still low, Australia's largest city goes into lockdown.
Even though we don't want to impose burdens unless we absolutely have to, unfortunately, this is a situation where we absolutely have to.
There's a lockdown coming in Bangladesh too. Thousands are trying to get out of the capital, Dhaka. Also on the newsroom with me, Jonathan Savage, 22 and a half years, one sentence, many questions.
I wanted to know from the man himself, why? What were you thinking? What was going through your head when you had your knee on my brother's neck.
George Floyd's family react to the sentencing of the police officer who killed him. We'll bring you the latest from Miami's collapsed tower block as the search for survivors goes on. Plus, Euro 2020's knockout round begins. And what does the US government know about UFOs? They're sharing their secrets. All to come on the BBC World Service.
BBC News. Hello, this is Jerry Smith. Thousands of people are trying to leave the Bangladeshi capital Dhaka as the country prepares for a strict nationwide lockdown starting on Monday. Infection rates have been rising rapidly for weeks. Here's John McGivering.
People surged across bridges and packed onto ferries in their thousands on Saturday, laden with possessions, all trying to beat the national lockdown. Many resorted to private transport or are simply trying to walk home. From Monday, public and private offices must close and people will only be allowed to leave their homes in an emergency. The government is resorting to this comprehensive lockdown after weeks of steadily rising cases. Their battle seems hampered by limited testing and low vaccination rates. In some areas, especially near the border with India, the healthcare system is already overwhelmed.
An extended coronavirus lockdown has taken effect in Sydney in Australia to contain a sharp rise in cases of the Delta variant. The restrictions will now cover all of the city and surrounding areas and will last for 2 weeks. From Sydney, Phil Mercer reports.
Australia has consistently maintained very low rates of coronavirus transmission. It has become a fortress in an attempt to keep the virus out. But the lockdown has again exposed flaws in its defences at the border that have allowed infections to escape into the community. The vaccination rollout here has also been slow. There are complaints that the government's planning has been confused, and there's been complacency as well. Fewer than 5% of the population are fully vaccinated.
Iceland is lifting all domestic coronavirus restrictions from today, meaning people will no longer have to wear masks or socially distance. The Health Minister, Svandís Svavarsdóttir, said it was possibly the first country in Europe to do so. She said the society Icelanders had longed for was being restored. Hong Kong's new police chief has called for legislation to tackle fake news, which he said was responsible for damaging the force's relationship with the public. A day after his appointment, Raymond Siu said some news reports gave young people the wrong impression of the police. The Hong Kong force was widely held in high regard until its handling of protests 2 years ago tarnished its reputation. It's also played a central role in enforcing the unpopular national security law. The authorities in Myanmar have set fire to illegal narcotics worth hundreds of millions of dollars to mark the International Day Against Drug Abuse and Trafficking. In Yangon, drugs including opium, heroin, ketamine and crystal meth created a blaze so fierce that firefighters had to douse the flames. There were similar ceremonies in other cities. Myanmar's government and the UN announced a record haul of drugs in May. BBC News. Reports from Afghanistan suggest that the Taliban have claimed further gains overnight, driving out government forces in districts in the south and just north of the capital, Kabul. President Biden has assured the Afghan President Ashraf Ghani of America's continuing financial and political support after the two men met in Washington. Mr. Ghani dismissed accusations that the US, which is planning to withdraw its troops in September, was abandoning his country.
We respect this decision. We are fully satisfied that this decision has been taken in the spirit in which it's offered, which is not abandonment of Afghanistan, but a new chapter in our relationship.
The Czech authorities say 5 people are now confirmed dead after a tornado ripped through an area near the border with Slovakia on Thursday. Dozens more remain in hospital and some are seriously injured. Hungary's Justice Minister Judith Varga has told the BBC that her country firmly rejects criticism from Western Europe of a new law banning the promotion of homosexuality to under 18s. She said it was designed to protect children and guarantee the rights of parents. Ms. Varga described EU criticism as a misinterpretation of the law and insisted Hungary did not discriminate against anyone.
This law does not apply to adults. This law is actually there to protect our children. And it's very shameful that there is this unfounded, quite unprecedented, concerted attack against our country.
The 108th edition of the world's most prestigious cycle race, the Tour de France, is underway. For the first half hour, competitors are parading round the western city of Brest before getting down to the race proper. And that's the BBC News.
Hello, you're listening to the newsroom from the BBC World Service with me, Jonathan Savage. Now, we're going to start by talking about two countries, two very different countries who have a similar problem. As you may have heard in the bulletin, the government of Bangladesh has announced a nationwide lockdown, with cases climbing back up to 2/3 of the country's previous peak. Only 2.5% of the Bangladeshi population is fully vaccinated. Dhaka feels strict measures are needed to protect lives and preserve healthcare. In much wealthier Australia, the vaccination rate is only slightly higher. And after a spike in cases, officials in its largest city, Sydney, are getting worried too. Now, to some, Australia has been a paragon of how to respond to COVID-19. In fact, there have been barely 30,000 confirmed infections and just 910 deaths. Where outbreaks do occur, the reaction is fast and hard, locking down whole cities after just a few confirmed cases. Such is the case for the next 2 weeks in Sydney and the state of New South Wales, just a day after authorities already imposed partial lockdowns in the city. Speaking at a news conference, the state premier Gladys Berejiklian said there was no other choice.
Even though we don't want to impose burdens unless we absolutely have to, unfortunately, this is a situation where we absolutely have to. A few days ago, I said this was the scariest time that I felt since the pandemic started, and that's proven to be the case.
This Sydney cafe owner said lockdown was a big blow to businesses in the area.
Really bad case of deja vu. We've been struggling trying to get it back from the lockdowns of last year because this area is always subject to tourism, both domestic and foreign. So today just feels like another kick while you're slowly getting up. So pretty bad, pretty miserable, pretty depressing.
So what did Gladys Berejiklian mean when she said this was the scariest phase of the pandemic? I asked our correspondent Phil Mercer in Sydney.
I think what she means is the highly contagious nature of this Delta variant that is blamed for this latest outbreak, centering on the beachside suburb of Bondi here in Sydney. Now, this came to light in the last week or so, and in the Australian context has grown very quickly. Now, parts of Sydney entered a lockdown on Friday. That covered about 4 parts of the city, but since then officials now believe that even tougher measures are needed to contain a growing cluster of infections. So what we now have is Greater Sydney, that's the entire city, and also populated areas to the north, to the south and to the west. So that means that millions of Australians in Sydney and beyond must now stay at home for at least the next 2 weeks.
In a country where the pandemic response has been to close the borders and to have a series of short, sharp lockdowns whenever there's been a very small outbreak, how is this going down?
Australia has consistently maintained very low rates of coronavirus transmission. It's become effectively a fortress in an attempt to keep out the virus. Most foreign nationals were banned from Australia in March of last year, but this lockdown in Sydney and elsewhere has again exposed flaws in Australia's defences at the border that have allowed infections to escape into the community. This latest outbreak is linked to a limousine driver working with international aircrew at Sydney's airports, and also the vaccination rollout here has been very slow. There are complaints that the government's planning has been confused, and there certainly has been complacency in the community, and fewer than 5% of the Australian population are currently fully vaccinated.
That's Phil Mercer in Sydney. Now, as you may know, early on in the pandemic, Australia, along with New Zealand, effectively closed their borders. There was no quarantine-free international travel. Then in April, Australia and New Zealand together opened up a travel bubble where you could travel between the two countries. Well, New Zealand has just announced that it is pausing its travel bubble with Australia for 3 days amid the growing COVID-19 outbreak in Australia. They had paused it with New South Wales, the state where Sydney's located, but that now has been extended to all of Australia. No travel bubble between New Zealand and Australia for the next 3 days. Some measure of accountability. That's how a lawyer for the family of George Floyd has described the sentence handed down to the former policeman Derek Chauvin. A judge in the US city of Minneapolis gave Chauvin 22.5 years in jail, but the family of the victim and some civil rights activists had been hoping for an even tougher sentence. Neda Tawfiq is in Minneapolis and spoke to people who had gathered to watch Friday's proceedings.
The court commits you to the custody of the Commissioner of Corrections for a period of 270 months. That's 270.
1 year and 1 month after Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd, he learned the punishment for his crime.
This is based on your abuse of a position of trust and authority, and also the particular cruelty shown to George Floyd.
Before the judge sentenced him to 22.5 years in prison, the court heard emotional statements from the Floyd family. First to speak was Mr. Floyd's 7-year-old daughter, Gianna.
Say anything to your daddy right now, what would it be?
It would be, I miss you and I love you.
His brother Terrence called for the maximum sentence of 40 years. Addressing Chauvin directly, he voiced the many unanswered questions he had about his brother's killing.
I wanted to know from the man himself, why? What were you thinking? What was going through your head when you had your knee on my brother's neck? Why, when you knew that he posed no threat anymore, he was handcuffed, why you didn't at least get up?
The sentencing also provided a chance for the public to hear more for the first time from Derek Chauvin's side. His mother defended his character.
The media, public, and prosecution believe Derek to be an aggressive, heartless, and uncaring person. I want this court to know that none of these things are true and that my son is a good man.
And then Chauvin broke his year-long silence.
At this time, due to some additional legal matters at hand, I'm not able to give a full formal statement at this time. But very briefly, though, I do want to give my condolences to the Floyd family.
No justice! No peace! No justice! No peace!
A crowd listened to proceedings from outside the courthouse. Not all were happy with the outcome.
Minnesota does not like black people, period. Y'all keep proving it to us time in and time out.
Stop killing us, please. That's all I got. It's straightforward. They've killed so many of us. It's not just about George Floyd. He wasn't the first one to die due to police brutality, and he wasn't the last one.
His name!
George Floyd!
I have never seen a better time for reform.
Mary Moriarty was a chief public defender in Minneapolis.
The Minneapolis Police Department has a history, not a good history. There are good officers. This country was really big into the war on drugs and mass incarceration. And so it's no wonder we have that culture in certain police departments, and I think we've been paying for that for some time.
The family hopes this will be a turning point for America, but George Floyd's aunt Mahalia Jones was clear-eyed about the difficult path ahead.
You know, we did good to get the verdict. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Now, does the punishment fit the crime? No, it doesn't. But you know what? This is why it's so important for us to keep fighting for equality, for a better judicial system. It just tells us as a black America, brown America, and even white people that we just have more work to do.
Floyd's aunt Mahalia Jones ending that report by Neda Tawfiq in Minneapolis in the state of Minnesota. It's a moment of reckoning for Australian swimming after one Olympic medalist accused what she called misogynistic perverts of using psychological abuse to exploit girls and young women. The National Swimming Authority has acknowledged there has been decades of unacceptable behaviour. To find out more, let's join our Asia-Pacific regional editor, Michael Bristow. Michael, what unacceptable behaviour are we hearing about?
Well, Swimming Australia doesn't go into any great detail in this statement it's put out today, Saturday. All as it says is just that there has been some kind of abuse going back perhaps decades involving certain people. Now, this perhaps relates to allegations over recent years. One, after the Olympics in London in 2012, when a report found that there was a toxic environment surrounding swimming in Australia that tolerated such things as bullying. So it could relate to that. It could also relate to these latest abuses, which you mentioned just then, which was laid out by an athlete, a swimmer called Madeleine Groves. She's an Olympic medal winner, and just this month she pulled out of the trials for the Tokyo Games because, as she said, as you said just there, some young girls and women were subject to abuse in Swimming Australia, in the general culture there. So we're not quite clear what it relates to.
I imagine for parents listening of talented young swimmers, there will be a lot of concern when they hear about this. Do we have any idea how widespread the problem is?
We don't have much idea about that either. We've got Madeleine Groves who's made a claim. The Australian media reporting that 6 other swimmers do have their complaints, but the swimming authorities say they haven't received those yet. What the authorities are saying is that they're taking this very seriously. They want a proper environment for swimmers. They say they're going to set up a panel, an all-female panel, who are going to hear a lot of these allegations and take them very seriously. So we're not sure yet how many people involved. We're not sure exactly what the allegations are, but Swimming Australia said they're going to try and get to the bottom of this over the next coming months.
Thank you, Michael. That's Michael Bristow, our Asia Pacific regional editor. You're listening to the BBC World Service. Jerry has the headlines.
A strict lockdown has come into effect in and around Australia's biggest city, Sydney, following a surge in cases of the Delta coronavirus variant. Meanwhile, in the Bangladeshi capital Dhaka, large numbers of people are trying to leave the city before new nationwide COVID restrictions are imposed. And the newly appointed police chief in Hong Kong has called for legislation banning fake news, blaming the media for a loss of public trust in the force.
There are still 159 people unaccounted for after the collapse of a block of flats near Miami Beach, despite an intense search for anyone who might still be alive in the ruins. No one has been rescued since the initial hours after the building came down. From Florida, our correspondent Will Grant.
I'm standing at the closest point the media can reach, and I'm having to speak through my face mask because there is thick smoke coming from the building itself. We've been told that the authorities run into sporadic fires as they're trying to pick their way through the rubble, and that does appear to be what's going on. It may also, of course, be partly dust from the rubble itself as that's being moved by earth-moving equipment, but the result is just a thick haze of very acrid smoke. We can see the balconies that didn't collapse but are all twisted metal, and just on the other side we can make out the sort of missing front of the building.
Bhavana, Vishal and Aishani, they're very loving.
I met Uma Kanayan, who is a member of the same temple as a British-American citizen, Bhavna Patel, who is still unaccounted for. Bhavna Patel is pregnant. Her husband Vishal and their 1-year-old daughter Ashani are also missing.
The family members were gathered at a community centre waiting desperately for information. That has now been moved to a hotel a little further down the street, but the desperation remains the same. But unfortunately there is no positive news to be given for the time being.
Uma said, like many families with missing relatives, that they're clinging on to the hope that the Patel family will have had a miraculous escape.
I always believe in miracles, but rationally we want to stay logical with the mindset that there is a strong possibility for miracles to happen. We have seen it all. We believe that the hope and prayers will show them to us in some form or shape. Hopefully will give us the strength to move forward once we gain some form of a closure to this matter.
As those hopes begin to fade, though, Uma Kanayan says those waiting for news also want answers about how this building could have collapsed in one of the richest cities in the richest country in the world.
That's truly a shock. I don't understand how this something in this manner could have happened. There's lots of speculation out there. There's lots of controversies out there. There's nothing to comment on that at this point. And, it gives you a new perspective of life. You go to bed one night and the next day morning, you're not really sure if you're going to be around. So treasuring each day is definitely a lesson that I think one should learn and value that, actually.
At the beach at Surfside, a group of local residents has come down, lit candles and put down flowers as a small offering of respect to what they increasingly fear will be the loss of their neighbours. When you look at the site itself, it's like the entire front of a dollhouse has been opened, or in this case simply ripped away, and we can see inside the homes, you can see individual beds, even fittings, wallpaper of some of the homes. It is a tragic and very harrowing sight.
Will Grant reporting. Back now to the pandemic, and the World Health Organization says it's concerned about the resurgence of COVID-19 infections in many African countries. It says health systems are seriously unprepared for an increase in cases. In many countries, only a fraction of the population has been vaccinated. They are having to rely on deliveries from COVAX, an international partnership which is trying to ensure everyone in the world has access to a COVID vaccine. One of the countries struggling to vaccinate its population is Kenya. Dr. Rudy Eggers is from the WHO.
COVAX did indeed deliver the majority of doses that are available in Kenya. So I think Kenya is quite grateful to COVAX for the vaccines that have been provided. There have been several other donations from some countries, but really the problem is that across the continent and here in Kenya, there is just not enough vaccine available. Kenya has shown the ability to actually deliver the vaccine. So the vaccine that has been made available to Kenya has successfully been given to people, but the availability is very scarce. For COVAX, of course, one of the main problems was the stop of the Indian-produced AstraZeneca vaccine that was held back by the Indian government. I do know that COVAX is now starting to address it, so we are anticipating the next shipments of COVAX within a month or so. I think Dr. Tedros, who's the Director General of WHO, made it very clear in his recent speeches that this situation is really untenable and constitutes a grave moral dilemma. You have situations where countries are able to vaccinate everybody, including those that are least at risk, while African countries or people that are at high risk in African countries, including health workers, are not vaccinated. The core of this is the availability of vaccines.
Dr. Rudy Eggers from the WHO. And it's all kicking off again. This afternoon, the first match of the round of 16 is being played at the European Football Championships. Let's go to Budapest and our sports reporter, Maz Faruqi. A game there today, is it? Who's playing?
Yeah, hello from Budapest. No last 16 matches here until tomorrow, but one of the favourites for this men's European Championship trophy in action later at Wembley Stadium in London. In fact, Italy, a side not really talked about as big contenders ahead of this tournament. Remember, they didn't even make the World Cup finals 3 years ago, but they're playing such impressive football, 3 wins from 3, and their manager Roberto Mancini has revolutionised the way they play, made them really attacking, really exciting going forward. And against an Austria side who have never been in the knockout stages of the Euros before, they will be big favourites, and I think it will be a big shock if the Italians weren't to make it through to the quarterfinals. Before that, in around 5.5 hours' time, Denmark will play Wales. Wales, unexpected semi-finalists 5 years ago at the Euros. They themselves, though, have spoken in the build-up to this game in Amsterdam that they know Denmark are the side a lot of neutrals around the world will be backing as they take to a football pitch 2 weeks on since Christian Eriksen suffered that cardiac arrest in their opening match of this tournament.
So, Maz, I'm actually going to Wembley today for Italy v Austria. I'm expecting a different kind of atmosphere for a football game. Tell us a bit about what the atmosphere has been like for fans at this tournament and what it's like in Budapest just now.
Well, I mean, it's been a very interesting atmosphere. We obviously have here, we had about 8,000 French fans, 6,000 Portugal fans for the last match that was played at the Puskás Arena here. A lot of neutral fans, though, and it obviously makes an exciting atmosphere, a different atmosphere, but not necessarily the roaring crowds that we've been used to at major tournaments before. Before that, Italy, match later. I really expect it to be a fantastic atmosphere. As we said, the Italians are so exciting going forward at the moment. So I'm very jealous. I bet you're going to get lots and lots of goals at Wembley Stadium later.
Well, I hope so. And I will do my best to roar if there are that many people doing it. We're expecting, 22,500, I think, at Wembley, and then 90,000. I'll make a decent noise there, I think. Maz Faruqi in Budapest, thank you very much for speaking to us on this edition of the Newsroom. Of course, future editions of the Newsroom will keep you up to date with the Euros. Right, let's cross back over to Jerry. He's got some other stories from our news desk.
The Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan is due to formally inaugurate his controversial flagship Istanbul Canal project today. But critics say the event is government propaganda. He'll attend what the government describes as a groundbreaking ceremony for the canal, which aims to connect the Black Sea with the Sea of Marmara. Environmentalists say the canal project is crazy and will jeopardise the water supply for the whole region. The Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says he's asked Pope Francis to come to Canada to apologise on behalf of the Catholic Church for the running of residential schools for Indigenous children. His request comes after the grim find this month of about 1,000 unmarked graves near two of these schools, most of them containing the remains of children. Mr. Trudeau apologised for the Canadian government's policy in the last century, sending thousands of Indigenous children to the mainly Catholic boarding schools.
This was an incredibly harmful government policy that was Canada's reality for many, many decades. And Canadians today are horrified and ashamed of how our country behaved. About a policy that ripped kids from their homes, from their communities, from their culture and their language, and forced assimilation upon them.
Indonesia has recorded its biggest daily increase in coronavirus cases on Saturday, with just over 21,000 new cases, taking the total tally to more than 2 million. Indonesia has the highest number of coronavirus cases and deaths from COVID-19 in Southeast Asia. And for the first time ever, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence here in the UK has recommended mental health support for people severely affected by their acne.
Jerry, thank you. Now, when US intelligence agencies announced they would finally tell us what they know about UFOs, it got a lot of people very excited. Would the Pentagon admit what some had long suspected, that unidentified flying objects were real and the US government had hidden proof of visiting life from other planets? Well, this is the last story in the programme, not the lead, which might give you a clue. But the report has been released, and what does it say? Here's Sophie Long.
For decades, what the US intelligence community knows about UFOs, or, as the Pentagon likes to call them, unidentified aerial phenomena, has been shrouded in secrecy. Now an official report has revealed it knows very little. A task force examined more than 140 sightings of mysterious flying objects over the past 2 decades. Investigators found no evidence that the encounters, most of which were by US Navy pilots, represented extraterrestrial life. But it does acknowledge that remains a possible explanation. Those who've been mocked for monitoring the skies searching for answers never expected the report to provide any closure. But after decades of campaigning to get the US government to take the issue seriously, they see it as an important step forwards on the path to finding the truth they believe is out there.
Sophie Long on a report, bringing us somewhat back down to earth, though still plenty of questions to be asked. You've been listening to the Newsroom from the BBC World Service with me, Jonathan Savage. Thanks for your time.
You're listening to the BBC World Service, where Razia Iqbal discusses the future of public healthcare.
I'll be joined by Dr. Paul Farmer, the renowned physician, anthropologist and writer, to answer questions from people about healthcare where they live or work.
In your experience of other countries, have you seen such an approach work well, and what can we learn from it?
If you look at outliers like Rwanda, those are the countries that invest the largest fraction of their public treasury in healthcare and education.
We'll be discussing the pandemic, of course, but also the rise in mental health problems, how to tackle malaria, TB, and how we care for our elderly.
What would be the framework that would protect anyone when they were critically ill or injured? And you just can't find a framework that's more expansive than the idea of healthcare as a human right, and maybe even health as a human right.
A right to health in half an hour.
This is the BBC World Service. Namaste. I'm Devina Gupta, and coming up on Work Life India. Access to nutritious food has been a big problem for millions of children in India, which has worsened in this pandemic. So we're asking, how has COVID impacted India's child malnutrition crisis? That's after the news.
BBC News with Jerry Smith. There's been an exodus of people from the Bangladeshi capital Dhaka ahead of a strict nationwide lockdown on Monday. Thousands are leaving the city amid a dramatic surge in coronavirus cases. An extended 2-week coronavirus lockdown has taken effect in Sydney in Australia to contain a sharp rise in cases of the Delta variant. Police warned they have car licence plate recognition technology to ensure residents don't stray from the lockdown zone. In contrast, Iceland is lifting all its domestic coronavirus restrictions. The health minister said it's possibly the first country in Europe to do so. Hong Kong's new police chief has called for legislation to tackle fake news, which he says is responsible for damaging the force's relationship with the public. The Hong Kong force has played a central role in enforcing the unpopular national security law. Reports from Afghanistan suggest the Taliban have made further gains overnight after heavy fighting in many parts of the country. Correspondents say government forces regained control of a district in one eastern province, but lost others in the south and just north of Kabul. The authorities in Myanmar have set fire to illegal narcotics worth hundreds of millions of dollars to mark World Drug Day. In Yangon, the blaze was so fierce that firefighters had to douse the flames. Hungary's Justice Minister has told the BBC her country strongly rejects EU criticism of a new law banning the promotion of homosexuality to under-18s. Judith Vorga said it was a shameless misinterpretation of the law and added that Hungary didn't discriminate against anyone. The 108th Tour de France is getting underway in the city of Brest. Spectators will have to socially distance and wear masks. And that's the BBC News.
Hello and namaste, I'm Devina Gupta and this is Work Life India on the BBC. Now this week started with a bit of a shock. I was browsing online and stumbled upon the latest National Family Health Survey by the Indian government. It painted a grim picture of how in a majority of the states, stunting and wasting in children under the age of 5 was increasing. And we're looking at millions of children being at risk. In fact, I found out that in 2019, UNICEF had highlighted 69% of deaths in the children under the age of 5 were because of malnutrition. And this situation has just gotten worse with the onset of the pandemic in 2020. So I decided to do a quick ground check and travel to a village just 2 hours away from the national capital, Delhi, in a region called Nu in the North Indian state of Haryana. In the blistering summer heat, I met local health workers called Anganwadi workers to visit some homes and speak to some families and find out how has COVID impacted India's child malnutrition crisis. A cry of helplessness. It's a hot summer afternoon and 1-year-old Samreen is restless in her mother's arms. Her eyes are lined with coal and her green shirt and blue pajamas are hanging loose on her body. Born during the peak of the pandemic last year, she has been fighting for a chance at a healthy life every day. She's a severely malnourished child and weighs less than a 2-month-old. Her mother Afsana tells me she feels helpless seeing the baby's strength ebbing away slowly. She's so weak. Look at her legs, they are so thin and bones are jutting out from her chest and back. How will she live another summer? Afsana tells me. She says access to nutritious food and proper medical aid has been difficult in this village and so her daughter has been unable to gain weight. Afsana has 4 other children. In normal times, families like her would have been taken care of by the public childcare center in their village called Anganwadi. But in the pandemic, many are closed. I make my way to one of them. I meet 60-year-old Lachowati here who agrees to unlock it and show me around. It's a small room that speaks of neglect. The yellow paint is peeling and there is no fan or even a light bulb. Daylight is seeping in through the cracks in the wooden windows. Lachowati shows me packets of wheat, rice and dry milk powder stored in cardboard boxes here. She tells me earlier she cooked hot meals for pregnant women and children every day. These meals were provided free of cost to all. But now this center is shut. And Lachowati says they only distribute small ration kits to families whenever they get supplies from the government.
When we get dry milk packets or wheat and rice, we make food kits and distribute it to people here. But it's not enough to cover growing children and expecting mothers. We don't get sugar or oil or pulses that can provide them the nutrition they need. Namaste.
As I move out of the center, I meet Hema and Poonam. They are young Anganwadi workers who have been braving it out in the pandemic. When children weren't allowed to step out, they started monthly home visits to monitor their weight, risking their own health. They prioritize distribution of limited ration kits and protein bars to malnourished children. Today they are visiting the home of 6-year-old Khushbu, who according to them is moderately malnourished. As we enter the home, Hema takes out a portable weighing scale from her bag and hangs it from an iron peg in the wooden door frame. It has a small hook and a blue cloth sling is hanging at the bottom to securely hold children. Poonam lifts Khushbu by her arms and puts her on the sling. And as the weighing scale tilts over 13 kilos, Poonam tells me that Khushbu has made some progress.
We can see she is steadily gaining weight and is coming out of the yellow zone. It is a big win for us.
But Poonam agrees more needs to be done because even with these efforts, children like Samreen are among millions that are slipping out of the nutrition net in this pandemic.
So this is one of the most difficult stories that is emerging in this pandemic. It was painful to see these children struggle for a shot at a healthy life, at a productive life. Is there a way to save them? Well, let's get our panel in. First on the panel is Dr. Pavitra Mohan. He's community health physician and co-founder of Basic Health Services. His team works to spread more awareness about child malnourishment in the western state of Rajasthan. Thank you, Dr. Mohan, for joining us. We've just heard from some of the rural health workers called Anganwadi workers. What's the situation in this pandemic in your area, in the western state of Rajasthan?
Devina, I think to answer that question, we have to understand that these are the areas that we work in, which are South Rajasthan, rural South Rajasthan, where food availability was scarce even before the pandemic. Now, during the pandemic, especially in the first phase, what happened was because of the lockdown, there was a sudden decrease in availability of food at the household level because people had no money, the ration shops had closed, even the neighborhood grocery shops ran out of stock, and therefore there was very little food. In the second wave again, there was an abrupt decline in family wages because the economy was going down. The people had lost their money, and a lot of people who would earn money out of migration to cities were not able to do so. This was unfortunately also coupled with the fact that Anganwadis, which you had shown
Yes.
from Haryana, they kind of stopped. They have been roughly not functioning for last 1 year. That has led to a persistent risk for children to both get into severe malnutrition and diseases. So that's what we are we are seeing at the moment.
And to put this in perspective, according to India Child Wellbeing Report released by the World Vision India, around 115 million children are at risk because of the COVID-19 first wave. So what's happening in the second wave in the southern state of Kerala? We have Dr. Srihari M, who's the nodal officer for child health. He's with the National Health Mission, who's also joining us. Dr. Srihari, what's been your observation? What are the parameters that you've seen shaken during the second wave in the child malnourishment, especially in the state of Kerala, where you are?
When we consider the whole scenario of malnutrition in the country, the Kerala scenario is a little different. Even if we take the baseline as 2018 or 19, the malnutrition in the state of Kerala is not that high in numbers. So we are also expecting, as warned by UNICEF and other UN agencies and World Bank studies and all, we are also expecting an increased malnutrition in among children. But after the first wave or even after the second wave, we have not noticed an increase in malnutrition to an extent which needs to be dealt in an emergency way.
So you're saying that amongst the states and union territories of India, you've noticed that Kerala has been an outlier, but also the National Family Health Survey has shown that Kerala has seen an increase when it comes to stunting in children. There has been an increase when it comes to underweight children below the age of 5. We'll talk a lot about this and where is the scenario headed. But let me get our third guest in, Sophie Healy-Thau. She's joining us from Ireland, and she is food systems and nutrition activist there. Sophie, welcome to the show. Are you seeing that there is a similar scenario playing out in other countries as well, and especially developing countries when it comes to child malnutrition?
Oh, definitely. I think it's the first time that people in global north countries have really experienced food insecurity. I mean, an additional 6.7 million children under the age of 5 are suffering from child malnutrition in 2020. In Ireland, we saw a 50% increase in demand for food by families. And this was impacted by COVID-19, of course, because people were losing their jobs. In Fiji, for example, we're seeing an increase in obesity in children. And this is due to the disruption in the food system, the disruption in food trade, which has ensured that the only food available in shops are high calorific, high sugar, high fat, but they're also affordable, which has meant that more people are buying these and feeding them to their kids. So it's a real crisis we're seeing across the globe. The rates of hunger are increasing and not enough people are talking about it.
Absolutely. And Sophie, you've hit the nail on the head. Malnutrition, as defined by the World Health Organization, in all its forms, includes undernutrition, that is, wasting, stunting, underweight, inadequate vitamins or minerals, overweight, obesity, and resulting in diet-related non-communicable disease. Let me pick up on where you said access to food and affordable food seems to be one of the major reasons why malnutrition is occurring in children here in India as well. But Dr. Mohan, it's a difficult paradox because what we're looking at is a food surplus country, a growing economy, which is not able to deliver food to its poor. Why is that? Where is the gap?
That's a good question. We often say that India is a food surplus and a food replete country, which is in average terms is right. But the question is that does it reach the right the right group of people who need it? Children in this case, and that too children from the most marginalized families. There are, I think in India, of course, we say it is multiple countries. In rural India and in remote rural India, in tribal India, there are areas where the land sizes are very small. The rainfall is erratic, and it is rain-dependent agriculture. For example, in the areas that we work in, the average land size is less than is half of an acre roughly. And within that, and when there is not enough water, you can't grow enough food for the family to survive. So, because of that, families go to cities for work. I mean, many young men from our areas migrate to cities like Ahmedabad and Mumbai to make their livelihoods. but what they earn is not sufficient to buy nutritious food, right? And that leads to a relative hunger where you may just have enough to survive, but not really grow, and leading and pushing many children into severe malnutrition.
But Dr. Srihari, has the pandemic also led in due course from last year more steps towards ensuring food security? For example, the central government scheme to distribute ration to 800 million people in these times, they have extended this scheme to November. Do you think it's enough or more needs to be done?
So that's the way actually Kerala has done something during this pandemic period. We initiated something like community kitchens, which were operating from communities. So for small communities like maybe 100 to 200 families, a common kitchen was developed, and they were saving cooked meal to the families, or maybe we really focused on the vulnerable groups. So whatever it be the system that you have available, that can be utilized in a better fashion so that things can be delivered at their home rather than asking people to come or take it.
So you kept the community kitchens running. You ensured that food is prepared in these kitchens and then delivered to various people in that community instead of just supplying ration. And Dr. Mohan, I want to come to the point that school meals are important. And India also has midday meal schemes, which have been put on hold because schools are shut at the moment. And that's another gap that needs to be filled by policymakers and civil activists. But here's the point. Even when the midday meal schemes were being rolled out, there was another problem and controversy around what constitutes a balanced diet. Some states refuse to even serve eggs to children. Your view on this?
What we found in our own areas, which are a lot of tribal communities, when we started our daycare centers and we introduced eggs, communities did not accept eggs in the beginning, because that's what they have been practicing for many years, that egg is bad for children and also for women, and especially for girl children, etc. But when we started communicating with the communities, demonstrating that it is it's tasteful, it is not fertile, there is no child or a chick inside, and gradually they started realizing the value of it, and now there is no resistance at all. So I think a lot of problem is of how do you engage communities, how do you build their understanding. The problem is that we often do not reach and judge communities, oh, they don't eat egg and they don't want their children to grow, etc., and that's where the barriers become even stronger.
So continuous engagement, communication is the key. But Sophie, the problem also is of gender inequality. When I went to this village in Haryana, I found out that limited ration that was coming to the families was being given first to the male child of that family rather than girls. And this was a big challenge even for the local health workers there to overcome. Could you tell us from your experiences, is there a way out for India in these scenarios?
Yeah, this is a really deep set societal issue where women and girls are not seen as equal to men and women. And specifically in households, this isn't just a problem for India. It is also a problem in areas like Kenya or Southeast Asia. What people tend to label young girls as is vulnerable, but they're not vulnerable. They're only in vulnerable positions that has been brought on to them by society. And the first thing to do is keep them in school as long as they can. I work a little bit in Kenya, so that's where I'm talking about. But we've seen this specific change in rural Kenya when people's eyes and minds are opened to the importance of all genders being nutritionally balanced and strong, both mind and body. We're also seeing a change in the amount of young women taking up leadership positions in rural communities, and these young women having those role models close to them is also extremely important.
Yeah. So, Dr. Srihari, let's also talk about the cultural barriers when it comes to planning for nutrition programs in India for mother and the child. What kind of cultural barriers in communities have you faced also being extrapolated in this pandemic?
What we have usually from the tribal blocks and the rural Kerala, we face some of the problems like they tend to give water or maybe some other food items towards 3rd to 4th month of the baby, even though we say that baby should be fed only with breast milk in the first 6 months. Then one other challenge that we have at this point, and when we are looking at why our indicator for exclusive breastfeeding for 6 months is not improving, we found that many women are working. So that when you look at the indicator, 6 months exclusive breastfeeding may not happen. So these are some of the real life situations that we have seen, and we are trying to address it.
But Dr. Mohan, here's the point. Even as Dr. Srihari spoke about that, how it's difficult for women to find time when they're working in cities to breastfeed their children, at least for the first 6 months. There is a maternity leave for 6 months as ensured by officers. But during the lockdown, it was difficult for many of them who are also taking primary responsibility of taking care of the elderly and the vulnerable in their family in urban areas as well. Do you see then that there could be going ahead problem of child malnourishment even in homes that are privileged homes compared to what we've seen in rural India?
So before that, I would like to say that even in rural areas, one of the major so food is one important reason why children get malnourished. The other is the care that children receive from their parents or from the other caregivers. In many of these rural areas, a lot of women, a lot of young men migrate to cities for work. Women are left behind, and they have to do the from getting up, work in the fields to look after the elders and the animals, and that leads childcare really is non-existent. And therefore, I think the daycare centers for children under 3 years to 5 years of age is so critical. To the question, which is to some extent available to women in urban areas, right? I mean, there are creches in urban areas in larger cities, especially, or you have other safety nets. But in rural areas, that just doesn't exist. But yes, I mean, and I think while India has a policy of 6 months of maternity leave for everyone, whether you're working in a formal sector or in an informal sector. But as Dr. Srihari said, that even in Kerala, that probably is not enforced. That's why many women forced to stop breastfeeding because they have to go back to work, and that's something that needs to happen. So I think two things. One is having these daycare centers where childcare can be provided to all children who need it under 5 years of age. And the second is to enforce, making the 6 months of maternity leave available for everyone, every woman, whether she's in the formal sector or in a government job, or she's working in a brick kiln or in a construction site.
But what are the other practical solutions that can be implemented? And Dr. Srihari, from your own experience with the National Health Mission, could you talk about certain practices which promote local food produce, which has helped people in certain communities understand what they're eating better and trying to focus their budget on such kind of foods?
There were a few examples that I can tell you. The Women and Children Department, through the ICDs, Anganwadi centers, they are engaging community of the families of those children coming there to have a garden, community, the kitchen garden, which is set by the families along with the Anganwadi worker. The children will be part of doing all these sort of activities, and different type of vegetables are being cultivated there and are being used in the cooking. So that is some way adding value to the nutrition, that is the supplement that they are getting. So these are all good models that can be replicated, and that's being done. So community engagement through all these activities is really relevant.
Well, ICDS is Integrated Child Development Services. But Sophie, coming to you, you've carried out an interesting experiment, which is of a food bank at your university. And is that a scalable model that can be utilized by local communities, especially during the time of the pandemic, to help at least ensure that balanced diet is given to children in their community?
Yes, definitely. So, what we were finding on my university campus was that students could not afford healthy, nutritious foods on a daily basis. So, we set up a food bank on campus, and to gather the foods that we found that we stocked on our campus food bank was we collected excess foods from local shops and supermarkets, and these were foods that were going out of date but were still available or fresh to eat. And there are many examples of these kind of initiatives across the globe. And one more, if I could say, is
Sure, please go ahead.
there is an organization in Kenya, and this group is called AgriMan. So they go into these schools dressed up as this agricultural superhero, explaining to children about how you can be a superhero if you eat a nutritious, balanced food, if you take part in agriculture in a climate-friendly way. So these are all really fun ways to engage young people in a sector that is often ignored.
Well, great ideas there, Sophie. And I remember seeing this cartoon when I was a kid, Popeye the Sailor Man, who would eat spinach and suddenly his muscles would pump, and taking inspiration from it to eat more spinach. But coming back to the issue at hand, and as we wrap up, Dr. Mohan, then the last word from you, because India has a nutrition strategy that is in place. The aim is to reduce all forms of malnutrition by 2030. But given the exigency of the pandemic right now, what are the lessons that India can learn from it, and what's the road ahead to achieve this target?
So, broadly, one thing we need to do is to move away from the concept of food security to nutrition security. It is not sufficient for people to have just food to survive, but to really grow. And that nutrition security is what we should really aim at. The other kind of an important thing right now is to really diversify our public distribution system. Because as of now, as I said, that in most states, it only focuses on providing grains. So I think providing and expanding the net, and while some states like Tamil Nadu and Chhattisgarh have already been including pulses and oil in the public distribution system, which is for the marginalized one of the biggest sources of access to food.
Absolutely. So affordability, accessibility, and most importantly, availability of nutritious food is needed for children. Because if we don't feed our children, it impacts their cognitive abilities and development. And going ahead, this is the future generation that we are looking at being wasted. And for a country with a younger population like India, the consequences are devastating. But thank you, each one of you, for explaining this particular issue and giving us your crucial insights. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us as well. It's an issue that requires urgent attention and action. It requires collaborative efforts between governments, policymakers, and it also requires each one of us to do our bit as well to make our future generations healthier and more productive. To write in with your views on this subject on Delhi_WorkLifeIndia at bbc.co.uk. You can even tweet using hashtag WorkLifeIndia. Until we meet next time, it's Namaste from me, Devina Gupta.
This is the BBC World Service, and on this week's assignment...
Amaini Jones in Nigeria, where a wave of mass kidnappings has gripped schools in the north. Gunmen have abducted over 1,000 students and staff and killed 9 of them. But what do the hostage takers want, and how can they be stopped?
Journeys to the heart of a story. Assignment at bbcworldservice.com/assignment. And at bbcworldservice.com, Stumped with Alison Mitchell.
We hear from former Sri Lanka captain Kumar Sangakkara on being inducted into the ICC Hall of Fame and what he thinks should be the priorities for Sri Lanka cricket. Plus, we debate whether women's test matches should be 5 days long instead of 4.
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
This is the BBC World Service. I'm Razia Iqbal, and this is a special programme on health and healthcare. In the next hour, we'll be discussing questions from people around the world with Dr. Paul Farmer, an award-winning physician and writer. He's written extensively on health, human rights, and the consequences of social inequality. And he's worked around the world, from Haiti to Peru, from Russia to Africa. His has been a lifetime of work helping provide healthcare systems for some of the world's poorest populations. We'll be hearing from practitioners and members of the public, all lined up with their questions from China, India, Nigeria, the United States, Brazil, and Europe. We'll be discussing the pandemic, of course, but also the rise in mental health problems, how to tackle malaria and TB, inequality in healthcare provision, and how we care for our elderly. So do stay with us to hear A Right to Health with Dr. Paul Farmer straight after the BBC World Service News.
BBC News. Hello, this is Jerry Smith. Thousands of people are trying to leave the Bangladeshi capital Dhaka as the country prepares for a strict nationwide coronavirus lockdown starting on Monday. The number of cases has been rising quickly for weeks, many attributed to the Delta variant, which has spread rapidly in neighbouring India. Here's Jill McGivering.
People surged across bridges and packed onto ferries in their thousands on Saturday, laden with possessions, all trying to beat the national lockdown. Many resorted to private transport or are simply trying to walk home. From Monday, public and private offices must close, and people will only be allowed to leave their homes in an emergency. The government is resorting to this comprehensive lockdown after weeks of steadily rising cases. Their battle seems hampered by limited testing and low vaccination rates. In some areas, especially near the border with India, the healthcare system is already overwhelmed.
An extended lockdown has taken effect in the Australian city of Sydney to contain a sharp rise in cases of the Delta variant. The restrictions will last 2 weeks and now cover the entire city and surrounding areas. Australia has been largely successful in containing COVID, but has vaccinated a relatively small percentage of the population. From Sydney, here's Phil Mercer.
Most foreign nationals were banned from Australia in March of last year, but this lockdown in Sydney and elsewhere has again exposed flaws in Australia's defences at the border that have allowed infections to escape into the community. This latest outbreak is linked to a limousine driver working with international aircrew at Sydney's airport.
Iceland is lifting all domestic coronavirus restrictions from today, meaning people will no longer have to wear masks or socially distance. The health minister said it was possibly the first country in Europe to do so. Several lockdowns and a rigorous test and tracing programme have kept deaths and infections low. The government says 87% of people have now received at least one dose of a vaccine. Hong Kong's new police chief, Raymond Siu, has called for legislation to tackle fake news. He said it was responsible for damaging the force's relationship with the public. Our Asia-Pacific editor, Michael Bristow, has more details.
One day after his appointment, Raymond Siu has made a request that's likely to be controversial. He said some news reports gave young people the wrong impression of the police, and the force wanted those who spread disinformation to be brought to justice. In a week when Hong Kong's main pro-democracy media outlet was forced to close, the police chief's remarks will concern many. The Hong Kong force was widely held in high regard until its handling of protests 2 years ago tarnished its reputation. Despite that, Mr. Siu said many people still supported the police.
World news from the BBC. The owners of a cargo ship which caught fire and sank in Sri Lankan waters last month have agreed to pay the government more than $3.5 million. The payment will cover the compensation to fishermen. Correspondents say it's likely to be the first in a series of settlements. The Express Pearl was carrying almost 1,500 containers, many filled with chemicals. Experts are still assessing the impact of the accident on the marine ecosystem. Dead turtles, fish, whales and dolphins have recently washed ashore. Hungary's Justice Minister Judit Varga has told the BBC that her country firmly rejects criticism from Western Europe of a new law banning the promotion of homosexuality to under-18s. She said it was designed to protect children and guarantee the rights of parents. Ms. Varga described EU criticism as a shameless misinterpretation of the law and insisted Hungary did not discriminate against anyone.
Every individual is free to live their own way, how they want to live. There is no discrimination. The law does not focus on any kinds of sexual orientation. It is generally focusing to guarantee the parents' rights to form the education of their children, because they are minors.
The Czech authorities say 5 people are now confirmed dead after a tornado ripped through an area near the border with Slovakia on Thursday. Dozens more remain in hospital and some are seriously injured. The Prime Minister, Andrej Babiš, returned early from a European Union summit in Brussels to inspect the damage. He called it catastrophic and said he would apply for EU emergency funds. The 108th edition of the world's most prestigious cycle race, the Tour de France, has begun in the city of Brest. The 21 stages will end in Paris on July the 18th. Spectators must observe social distancing and wear masks. BBC News.
You're listening to the BBC World Service. I'm Razia Iqbal in London. Welcome to this special programme on health and healthcare. In the next hour, I'll be joined by Dr. Paul Farmer, the renowned physician, anthropologist and writer, to answer questions from people around the world about healthcare where they live or work. We'll be hearing from doctors, academics and members of the public in China, India, Brazil, Nigeria, the USA and Europe. Brought together with help from the Berggruen Institute. All are lined up with questions to put to him. Dr. Farmer is the latest recipient of the Berggruen Prize for Philosophy and Culture for his work in healthcare. He's written extensively on health, human rights and the consequences of social inequality. And he's worked across the world, from Haiti to Peru, from Russia to the continent of Africa. His has been a lifetime of collaboration, helping set up healthcare systems for some of the world's poorest populations. The jury said he had reshaped our understanding of not just what it means to be sick or healthy, but also what it means to treat health as a human right. Dr. Farmer joins me now from Miami. Welcome, Paul, and very warm congratulations on the award, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Razia. It's great to be here. I'm very honored.
We have lots and lots of questions coming up, but I want to start by just rewinding back to your origins. I wonder if you can help us pinpoint that time in your life when you knew that you wanted to try and make a difference.
You know, I come from a very large family, 8 people, and we lived in very modest circumstances. And they were very caring, my parents. And I think they engendered in us an expectation that we would serve others no matter what we did as a profession. But I was pretty settled early on wanting to be a physician. I'm not sure why, Razia. I mean, I'd never really been to a physician. And then came this great experience of my young adult life going to Haiti. And those two things, my childhood and those first years in Haiti, really cemented my commitment, and it feels stronger than ever to me.
The experience in Haiti was prompted by something that happened in the United States, though, wasn't it? Your first introduction to people from Haiti.
It was true that as a child, I met members of the Haitian migrant farm worker stream in Florida who were culling citrus. And I look back and think, could that be related to the spark that I had in college, when again, I started writing about migrant farm workers in North Carolina, particularly the ones from the Haitian stream, as it's called, the Haitian migrant farm worker stream. And that just really changed my life. It ended up in me going to Haiti, and I've no doubt that that was the signal event of my young adult life. And, I have a deep debt of gratitude to Haiti. And any prize I get in the philosophical or cultural realm, I have to acknowledge the Haitians too. They have been my teachers for 40 years.
Give us a picture, if you will, of your first experience of going to the island and what you were doing there.
I'm sure that it made me a more tender-hearted teacher today because, after all, I was doing what a lot of young Americans do to this day, saying, oh, I will show up in Haiti and be of great assistance, But a 22-year-old with no professional training or skills is not likely to be of great assistance to people facing poverty and disease. That doesn't mean, however, that that person, the American student in question, can't develop a lifelong attachment to a place and a struggle. And those first years, just to give an example, I remember one day seeing something just terrible, a death in childbirth, and the survivor, a brother of this young woman, said, well, that is just the stupidest death you could imagine. And to me, that was like an epiphany. It was a stupid death. All deaths in childbirth are stupid. And so my interest in healthcare as a human right really comes from those early years. And just thinking, what would be the framework that would protect anyone when they were critically ill or injured? And you just can't find a framework that's more expansive than the idea of healthcare as a human right, and maybe even health as a human right. But the first time that you see a woman die in childbirth, if that doesn't shake the foundations of your existence, then it's hard to know what would.
Well, Paul, you've given us a small glimpse and insight into what drives you, and we've got lots of questions coming up, lots of people lined up with questions. Let's hear first, though, from the Berggruen Prize founder, Nicholas Berggruen, who I spoke to earlier. I began by asking him why the jury decided to give its prize for philosophy and culture to an anthropologist and, what's more, a medical doctor.
What they've done, historically it seems, is to find someone who not only is a deep thinker and has influenced others in the world, but also reflects a little bit what's happening in the world, meaning what are the deep concerns that we should try to be addressing. And I think they've done so by selecting Dr. Farmer, Paul Farmer. They did so when they selected initially Charles Taylor, and then Honora O'Neill, and Martha Nussbaum, and Judge Ginsburg. Each very influential, each influential beyond their work in terms of helping us as humans to think about how we should think about things like democracy, human issues, planetary issues. And what's interesting with Paul Farmer is that his field obviously is health. And health these days, unfortunately, is front and center. I think what Paul Farmer has pointed to is that health is really something that is a human good. It's part of us. And it should be for everyone at any level. If you don't have it, it's going to be very hard for you to function in society. And health at any level is something that needs to be supported and addressed. What's interesting is his work in places that are really difficult, including Haiti, points out to the fact that it is a fundamental right as a human, and it is part of the fabric of what makes a society successful or not. And now we've seen through the pandemic that it's also part of what makes the planet successful or not. And what we've seen today is if you don't have health, or if you have even one part of the world that's not healthy, that's suffering, you're at the risk of affecting the rest. And you've seen that with the pandemic. And what I think is important in selecting Paul Farmer is to say, if you have any part of the world that's unhealthy or suffering, you're at the danger of making the rest of the world suffer and unhealthy as well.
That was Nicholas Berggruen. Now, we have lots of questions for you, Paul. Let's begin with our first questioner. It is Melinda Gates, the co-founder of the Gates Foundation, which is, of course, one of the world's leading charitable foundations. Let's hear her question.
Congratulations on this well-deserved award, Paul. My question for you is, when you and I first met, one of the things I most admired about you was your connection, your human connection to every patient or person that we would run into. And my question to you is, what is the importance of connection, especially during this time of COVID-19 and the pandemic?
If I were looking for the roots of that, I would look in my own family origins. I come from a family of sociable people. So I think that that's the most important thing, Melinda, that, this ability to connect. But I also believe that everyone has it. Aside from a few sociopaths, people have this ability to connect to other people. And it's a wonderful thing. It's certainly the root of our work at Partners in Health for the last 40 years. How do we be together when we're alone, when we're forced to endure social distancing? And, you know, this is an era that we'll be looking at for many years to come. Obviously, the COVID era is not over, but I don't think we've sorted out yet how much our ability to connect across physical distance through Zoom, as we are right now, I don't think we've had a full accounting yet. I think we're going to see, looking back over this last 15 months and what will soon be 2 years and 3 years, a lot of acts of real compassion, real human connection across these heightened boundaries because of the pandemic. Everywhere I turn, I see this ability to have human connection without fail. So I do think that anybody can inculcate this, and dramatic events like this can sometimes lead to heightened acts of compassion. And I hope that we'll look back and see some of that as well.
Paul, a lot of your work has highlighted the challenges in healthcare where there is inequality. So let's move on to a couple of questions on that. We have a question first from Daisy Ventura, Professor of Global Health Ethics from the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. Let's hear her question.
Professor Farmer, your work has been a fundamental reference to generations of researchers in the field of global health. I thank you very much for everything. It's an honor to be able to pay tribute to your extensive contribution. In your book, Haiti After the Earthquake from 2011, you define the earthquake in Haiti as an acute on chronic event, one in which a natural disaster took a particular devastating toll because of the context in which it took place. Do you believe we could say the same regarding the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on vulnerable populations? Thank you very much for your attention.
That was Daisy Ventura speaking to us from Brazil. Hold the thought in your head, Paul, when you want to answer that question. But joining us live, we have Andrew Goddard, who is president of the Royal College of Physicians here in the UK. And his question is also about inequality. Andrew Goddard.
So my question is about health inequalities. And clearly the pandemic has shown that health inequalities don't just take a lifetime, they can make a big difference in just a few weeks. And we've seen that with the job that people do, where they live, where they are in the country, who they live with. In the UK, we've always been proud of our health service, but perhaps we are less proud now. And many health organisations, including my own, the Royal College of Physicians, we've got together to form an alliance, the Inequalities in Health Alliance. One of our main pushes is for a cross-governmental approach to dealing with health inequalities. So my question is, in your experience of other countries, have you seen such an approach work well? And what can we in the UK and other countries learn from it? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Goddard. And you know, I'm happy to say that I have seen that. I have seen a focus on the most disadvantaged pull up the whole healthcare system in the country of Rwanda. So if you think about where they were, you know, in hell in 1994 after the genocide against the Tutsi, working on the pragmatic things that were needed to build a health system, staff, stuff, space, systems, and support to that system, and to the patients, and to the staff. So, you know, to be involved in this in even a modest way, to see this happen in the course of only a decade, to see Rwanda have the steepest declines in mortality ever documented at any time in any place, has been really reassuring. And when I look at the UK and the United States, and Brazil for that matter, their response to the epidemic, I do think there's a lot that we could learn in these three countries and many others from Rwanda. And so I think there is this wonderful example that we need to understand better. What are the decisions they've made over the course of these years that led to such a good outcome?
Andrew Goddard, would you like to come back and just respond to what you've heard about the example of Rwanda?
Clearly in Rwanda, they took a whole system, whole nation approach. And I think we've all got to do that. And sometimes, you know, how your government is set up to address these issues is crucially important. And if those at the top of government make that decision, they can make it happen. And I guess that one of our roles as health advocates, if you like, is to push our government to do that.
I couldn't agree more, Dr. Goddard. And, you know, just looking around at, I know less about the UK, but in the United States, I think already we can see why we've done so uniquely poorly in responding to COVID prior to the vaccines. I think we can figure that out. And you've put your finger on one of the biggest problems, and that is the patchwork nature of our weak safety net. I'll just give an example. In Massachusetts, which is one of the healthiest states in the nation, there's 6 million people there. There are 350 local health departments in Massachusetts.
Let's stay with the issue of inequalities and indeed stay